hand over to Mark. Great to have you with us.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, it's a real honor to be here and to meet with you. The GEM3 program is combining, 5 of the words that really direct my research. Yeah, in terms of UConn, it's funny also because not only do we use UConn, but as a joke, really, we have as our mascot the Husky, which, Connecticut has nothing in common with Huskies, but because of the UConn bit, we kind of, as a joke, made it our mascot. So can you all see my screen here?
Yep, we
Okay,
can see.
Great. I'll talk about where I've come to in terms of forecasting and its relationship to being able to inform the biodiversity crisis we find ourselves in now. And I want to begin here, though, in the Arctic. And so, what is the reason that someone like me, who's really a fundamental biologist interested in just how does nature work, how did I become interested in these models and prediction? And it really comes down to some experiences I've had, and one of the most profound of which was in this Arctic site where I was studying fish migration. And this is where I first experienced climate change. And I mean, I experienced it, but I knew it existed. I'd read about it, and seen some great papers on it. But it wasn't until I truly experienced it at this site. And so every year we would go up to this site. It's about a 12-hour van ride north of Fairbanks, and you wind your way along a unimproved road, and then you come through the Brooks Range. And generally, we come in early May and get there in time before the lakes melt out and the fish start to migrate, so we can catch the fish and tag them and then see where they go across the landscape. And we do a number of things, just understanding their basic dispersal in biology, including genetics and genomics and movement patterns. And then 2015 came, and we'd heard reports that things were warming up early that year, and we changed our flight several times. And still, by the time we made it over those mountains and started to slide down that pass onto this Arctic plain that rolls into the Arctic Ocean, instead of seeing the snow that we expected, it was as green as Ireland. It was completely melted of its snow, and the ice was already melting on the lakes, such that the fish were already starting to move out. And so we missed our chance to get most of our fish. And this was really profound because we didn't expect this to happen for another month. And so instead of using the snow machines that we normally use to get our equipment into our remote camps, we use helicopters. And when we're in those remote camps, all day and all night, all we could hear was this sound of ice melting as the permafrost melted around us. And you could hear these rocks that had been encased in ice for 10,000 years that were falling out in this sort of drumbeat of climate change going across the landscape. And if you look at our site, so here is our camp, and down below is a stream. This was that really warm year in 2015. In 2016, when it was a more normal year, still warmer than average, but a little bit more normal. This is the same time of year, and we're camped in the same place, and you can see the difference. And you can see also that this thermokarst, this melting of permafrost, is just advancing across the landscape. And really, this is, as you get down into this thermokarst, there's a lake on the right there. And this is in that warm spring. You can see this whole mass of mud and ice that's melting out into that lake and providing nutrients now into ultra low nutrient lakes in the Arctic and into the streams. And so if I can overlay a picture, then the second year when we come back into that, you can see how it's advanced. And so as I put that over that, you can see that suddenly you start to move outward to the left there, and you see that the ice melts out. And it melted so much that I have to pan out and show those effects. And it's pretty dramatic. Arctic is basically given up and just given into that heat and melting away before your very eyes. And so that experience really suggested to me how important these issues were, and I really started to devote myself during that period and since then to trying to predict those effects so that we can hopefully mediate some of the worst effects on biodiversity and ecosystems, which provide so much to humans in the form of our medicines and services like preventing pollution. And also I think that they provide a lot to our culture and ideas. And so, let's go back to February 1985 for a second. Imagine that, many of us were born before then, but many of the students were born after that. And it is a really profound date in the history of mankind, but also the history of the Earth. And so if you go back to that date, what we find is that was the last month in recorded history, at least, in which global temperatures were within the range of normal. And so every month since then has been hotter than the average. And it kind of separates out the students that I teach from my experience, because they were born in this new age where they've never experienced a normal Earth. And so, I think for one thing, we have to protect against sort of this moving baseline where, each generation doesn't recognize what the Earth was really like and what we've changed and what we've lost. So you can see since that time, 1986, that every month now is highlighted in that red. And so we really have truly entered a new age, what I like to call the heat age. It took us 165 years to get there. So 165 years of releasing greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane and some others. And I think the truly astounding part about this, well, there's two things. One is that we understood the greenhouse effect back into the 1800s. So chemists had figured this out and had extrapolated it to understand the Earth and its effects. And so we knew about climate change and its potential before we really even recognized that bacteria were causing illnesses in humans. So before we understood not to put your water supply next to your sewage, we understood that climate change was a possibility. The other astounding thing is that even though they recognized it in the 1800s, they didn't think that humans would be able to release enough of these gases in the atmosphere to truly change the Earth. It seemed incomprehensible at the time, all the way up into the 70s, really. But we did it, yay. And it looks like in the next 30 years on our current trajectory, we'll add another 2 degrees Celsius to the Earth. And as we start to think about how we predict things and model, and we can take a lot of insights from the climate modelers. And so I met James Hansen for the first time last year, and it was an amazing experience because this was someone who, as a scientist, put themselves out there back in 1981, built a model of climate change. It was very simple. It was one-dimensional. I don't think this one even included oceans in it. But they put themselves out there and said, okay, this is what could happen if we continue to release greenhouse gas emissions. And it turned out to be not such a bad model. And so they did the science, and then they also were able to translate that and communicate it to the public. And in a hearing to Congress in 1988, which is really the start of the recognition of climate change impacts, at least in our country, he said basically, stop waffling. The greenhouse effect is here, where it's observable, we had the models, and now we're seeing the validation of those models. So really, a profound event in the history of science where we made those predictions and we're able to see them, unfortunately. So it was soon after that, in 1889, that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed to aggregate all those modelers together to make the inputs to those models consistent in terms of different scenarios, and to also organize the outputs so that they can be combined and understood in aggregate. And so, despite the pronouncements of James Hansen in 1990, the first report out said, all right, well, we still think it's going to be 10 years or more before we really understand that this is happening. They came back in 1995 and said, okay, yeah, you're right. 5 years later, it's discernible. We know it's happening now. James was right. Step forward to 2013, and those models have done such a good job of not only suggesting what had happened, after that, but in hindcasting, that now we have this idea that climate change is extremely likely. It's definitely caused by humans. And 2018, in the new report, the 1.5 degrees Celsius report on what it means to go from 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, the science has become so clear that basically the end result was, oh crap, it's happening and it's hard to stop. I think they used a little bit more official United Nations language for that, but that's the take-home message. Now we can compare that to the efforts in biology. So we're biologists, we're interested in describing the natural world, but we're also beginning to get interested in predicting it. And so the related and parallel organization, IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biology and Ecosystem Services, was formed, and they recently put out this big report on the state of biodiversity, and suggesting that we are in this new era, this Anthropocene of an unprecedented rate of global change. Now, sort of using a relatively straightforward extrapolation from current risks to species, they suggest about 1 million species are facing extinction. But the thing that I saw in this report, and comparing it to my reading of the IPCC reports, is just the huge degree of uncertainty we have in those predictions. We don't know really how many species are really at risk. We don't know which of those species necessarily. And we don't know how factors interact to determine those risks of extinction. And so we're really far behind. And we know that the big three are already at work in affecting biodiversity around the world. So we know that habitat degradation, invasive species, and overexploitation are causing extinctions, causing changes in ecosystems around the world. And those are really the biggest effects right now. But what now we're starting to see is at least the interaction of those drivers with climate change. And we're starting to suggest at least that as we go forward, climate change will become a bigger and bigger part of those drivers of biodiversity decline. And so as the temperature rises, I think it's up to us to be able to predict those effects. And talk a lot about extinction, but it's just as profound to have changes in abundance at the local level or changes in local ecosystems through these changes as well. But I think we need to predict these changes. And so, for example, which is the species that we should devote our resources to protect in terms of biodiversity decline? Is it the polar bear, which has sort of become the poster animal for climate change? Well, there's some reasons to say so. Other reasons maybe not. I mean, maybe it's the American pika, which is this you guys probably familiar with, and this thing has a huge warm coat on it, living at the top of mountains, and when the temperature rises, above room temperature, it basically cooks to death in that coat. Maybe it's the pika, maybe it's a tuatara that lives on some islands off the coast of New Zealand that produces all males when the temperature rises. That may be one of the ones that might go extinct. So we need to make these predictions in order to devote limited resource dollars to mitigating those changes, preventing those losses. And there's lots of species out there, and there are winners and losers. And so we can let the winners alone, but we need to figure out which ones are the losers. And unfortunately, for this little island rat, the bramble K. melamus, we didn't understand in time. These, not predicting and not putting our energy in that prediction has real costs. And in this case, we lost the species. This is due to the sea level rise from climate change. It was living on this island. We expected that it was in trouble, and so some folks from Australia went out on a boat to take the last ones off and put them in a zoo to try to keep them alive. And by that time, it was too late. The storm had come and wiped over the island and eliminated that species. So that's probably our first true direct climate change extinction, at least for a mammal. And we expect to see many more. So what I'll talk about is sort of the current state of our knowledge based on some work I've done to synthesize this information. I'll talk about sort of the holes in our predictions and how we can improve them. And I'd like to really move to that third section on ways forward and how we can all work together to build the better models to make these changes real. In terms of current predictions, the history of this is that we are far behind, and at least once climate change was recognized as a potential threat, biologists started to respond to it. And I think this is really the first comprehensive paper on the effect. Of course, we call it global warming back then, before we appreciated all the many differences that the climate change can add. And this paper by Peters and Garland was really about how we have these fixed nature reserves and how climate change was going to change that and maybe make them less effective as species had to move to track their climate across the landscape. And you gotta love that, back then people put in quotes from Shakespeare. I have to remember to do that in one of my papers at some point. And by the 90s, Michael Soule and the great conservation biologists suggested that scientists are finally becoming invested in this great challenge, the greatest challenge ever faced by any sentient species. Not mincing words, Michael. And since that time, there has been an explosion of interest in research on climate change. As I said, as I started to see these effects in my own systems, not only in Alaska, but also even close to home here in Connecticut, where we're seeing amphibian populations altered by climate change. I was writing one of my papers and wanted to have that open-end line of how many species were threatened by climate change. And, as I looked through the literature, it really varied quite a bit. And so, the suggestion again of 1 million species, which is a nice round number. But we looked into the studies, some said 15 to 37% of all species. Others were more particular to certain species like birds, mammals, and amphibians. And others were really based on particular systems like mountain systems. But again, lots of variance. So it was one of those situations where I said, okay, well, if no one else is doing this, I really think we need some sort of synthetic understanding. And so I turned to the approach of meta-analysis, analysis of analyses. And I found as many studies as I could that combine multiple species, because it turns out that single species studies are generally focused on the ones that are most endangered. And I wanted to get a view of both winners and losers here and try to at least get to a generality of risk. So in these 130 studies, they actually made over 500,000 predictions about different species and how they respond to climate change all across the globe. And so when you just aggregate those into a histogram, you see that some studies suggest zero risk, but other studies suggest more moderate risks or as high as 50%. And if you take the median there, it's at 8%. So maybe it's not 37% or 40%, but maybe it's not 0% either. It's about 8%. And we don't know how many species there are on Earth. Took 8 million here and did the math and said, okay, maybe about 600,000 species at risk. But it turns out, as I was doing that, I recognized, hey, that's not the real important part. What we really need to know is how our actions and how the warming of the Earth are reflected in that extinction risk. And so I went back to all the studies and found whatever climate models they use and the scenarios, and understood what temperature rise was for the Earth that led to those predictions of extinction risk or not, and then plotted those. And so here we have the increase in temperature from pre-industrial times. And as you'd expect, the percent extinction risk increases with a rise in temperature. But what surprised me and others was that it doesn't just rise, it accelerates. And so, with each step that we take in the direction of more and more warming, we actually enhance and accelerate that risk to extinction. When I talk about extinction, right, I mean the threat of extinction. I don't mean that those extinctions are necessarily realized. They may take a long time. We may implement conservation strategies to prevent them in time. And the climate may rebound and provide some protection in that way. But if we overlay where we are today at about 1 degree Celsius, we're looking at about a 3% risk. If we keep the Earth from going much beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, as the UN has suggested, then we have a modest increase to about 4%. So this is really support for that 1.5 degree Celsius threshold. Our current trajectory with the commitments of countries, and our hope is that the US in particular will start to play a bigger role in this, and other countries will ratchet up their policies, is going to get us to about 6% extinction risk. So you start to get into that acceleration of the curve. And of course, if we go business as usual and continue to release what we're releasing now, then we could face up to as much as 16% extinction risk, which is 1 in 6 species. And to think about looking out the window right now, many of us can do that and count 6 species and consider that one of those might be extinct, I think is pretty damning for what we're doing to the Earth. These threats are around the world, but more concentrated in certain regions. So South America, Australia, and New Zealand had the greatest risk. And this kind of makes sense. So in South America, there were a lot of endemic species, particularly on mountain ranges, that are at high risk of climate change because they're at the top of the mountain and they don't have anywhere to go. And the same is true not for mountains, but for islands where you have species, say on Australia or New Zealand, that very quickly lose their climate niche into the ocean and can't survive anymore. What's interesting is that most of our studies, 60%, come from North America and Europe. And so, a lot of our effort has been in those regions, but we need to shift that attention to places like South America, Africa, just to some degree Australia, but there are a number of studies there as well. The other part about it is that Asia is relatively unexplored in terms of predicted extinction risk from climate change. Only 4 studies, and I suspect that this region of Southeast Asia is actually at high risk, but there just haven't been any studies there. And so this is a bit out of date, and we're adding to that analysis now for a replay of this, and hopefully we'll see many more studies in those regions and get a better sense of those risks. So we start to get into the part about biology and modeling biology, and we expect that some taxonomic groups are going to be more at risk than others. In particular, amphibians and reptiles have been highlighted as sort of the canaries in the coal mine of climate change. And I think that's true, but at least in this analysis, you sort of see that in terms of them coming out as the highest risk, but there's no significant differences among these groups in this analysis. And so those whiskers overlap with the median of 8%. And this sort of makes sense because, at the end of the day, almost all of these models of extinction risk exclude 100 years of biology. And so they're essentially statistical representations that are not incorporating an understanding of the biology. And therefore, if we don't include the biology, then we can't differentiate among taxonomic groups very well. So, that's the best information we have from modeling, but it's not our best understanding. And so, in doing that, I quickly realized that we needed to do much better and needed to move toward approaches that incorporate that biology so we can have a true sense. And it may be that, 8% is still the median prediction. But what the models can do is really pinpoint which of those species and how do you prevent those losses. And so when we look at the current predictions and how we might improve them, we've had this grand expansion and deployment of correlative species distribution modeling. It's used approaches where you basically use a distribution, a range map of a species, overlay the climate, usually a couple easily obtained climate variables, and then make some correlations between that distribution and the climate, and then extrapolate that according to different climate change scenarios. And this is the approach that we're going to have to use quite often because we don't have any information about the full 8 million species out there. It's really easy to do now. It's very approachable. You can basically do it all in the comfort of your home and within an hour or minutes even, to the degree at which people have done now 80,000 species using this approach. And that's one approach that we can use a lot of species that we don't know much about and get some basic information. I'm not against the approach, but I think we also have to use the alternative approach, which is to incorporate our understanding of biology of those species. And so these are the studies that were in that 2015 paper, and you can see, like Michael Sully said, we are addressing this problem. There's a lot more studies in that red line following that up. But only a small percentage of those, about 23%, actually include any biological understanding at all, any mechanisms. And of those, mostly it's dealing with dispersal or demography, not these other things like species interactions and evolution. And so, we're still trying to make our way into this world of mechanistic modeling. The climate modelers did that in the 50s, right? And so they started with correlations and using sort of basic understanding of weather to make those predictions, and moved toward highly physical, chemical, mechanistic models that can predict the future. And that made all the difference. We're still not there. So, we're predicting these biotic responses to climate change without understanding dispersal. So, if you did include dispersal in those models, it was probably dispersal. If you did include a mechanism in those models, it was probably dispersal. But still 86% were not including that. And we know from the natural world that species disperse quite differently. And so if species are going to track their climate, they're going to need to be able to move with it. And so we look at the empirical information. These are log transformed histograms ranging from centimeters to 100 kilometers. You see that birds, disperse pretty well as we expect, and also large mammals, but small mammals do not. Amphibians do not. Plants, even worse. I'm talking more about meters for plants. You have the poor ant-dispersed plants, which I pulled out here, which are dispersed in centimeters. They're requiring an ant to move the seeds. And not only does dispersal vary quite a bit among taxonomic groups, again, to differentiate those different predictions, we need that information, but also within a taxonomic group, it's huge. So I work on amphibians, and there are green frogs that can move kilometers across the landscape to find your little garden pond and sit there and be happy. And I also study terrestrial salamanders that you find them under a log, they have their babies, you see their babies the next year. Maybe the babies move to the other side of the log, but they don't move very far at all. We also are modeling these changes to climate change at really coarse spatial resolutions. So on average, we found that we're modeling biotic responses at the scale of 3,600 square kilometers. And in part, this is matching to climate models, although increasingly we're getting these much more finer predictions. So just to give you a sense of that, this is what it looks like 3,600 square kilometers in Connecticut. And this is the dispersal distance of the spotted salamander that I study around its natal pond. And so a huge mismatch between the spatial dimensions for most organisms. This is some work by my student, Chris Nadeau. Overlay in the red, the model prediction resolution, and in blue, the actual distance at which the organism can disperse, their dispersal neighborhood. And the intersection is in the purple here. You see that we're probably doing okay for birds and large mammals, but you're not doing well for small mammals, herps, or plants. And so, if the organism is dispersing at this smaller scale, they may take advantage of microhabitats, microclimate areas. We should be matching the model to the organism's ability to move and to experience the environment. We do see through time that is starting to decrease in terms of the resolution. So maybe going from 3,600 square kilometers to 1,000, maybe even 100 kilometers. But for many species, we still have a ways to go, and we have gotten much better at being able to scale down those predictions and use them at a more local level. And finally, one more after this, but one of the things that's always sort of irked me about all this work is that we're generally predicting climate change responses without species interactions. About 94% of those studies excluded species interactions, only 6% included them. As a community ecologist, I think that species interactions are quite important, not only at local scales, but also even at determining species ranges. And when we look at the data, this is a bit out of date, but it does suggest that a majority of the extirpations of populations or extinctions of species are actually occurring through indirect effects of climate change on species interactions. And so, it's not necessarily the heat that directly gets you, it's the fact that the heat is going to eliminate your symbiont, or is going to decrease your food, or spread a new pathogen. And it's those indirect mechanisms that may be more important in many systems, and we're not including them. And finally, to get at one of the main thrusts of your research network, we're predicting biotic responses without evolution. And there was only one of those studies of the 131 that included anything about adaptive potential and its ability to mediate extinction risks. And this is a pretty dark subject, thinking about climate change and extinction, but what gets me up in the morning out of bed sometimes is the idea that evolution might save some of these species. But it's not included in these models. The one study that did include it was one on global lizard extinctions. And it was very rudimentary. They basically took one species of lizard, one population of that species, and evaluated heritability of one trait in the lab, and extrapolated that to the rest of the world. So for folks studying evolution, you understand that's pretty ludicrous to base your understanding on that. They concluded that there wasn't enough adaptive potential to save the lizards, but I think we need to do so much more in this area. And when we look across taxonomic groups, we were part of this special issue in evolutionary applications where each team looked at a different group. We took the amphibians and reptiles, people took insects, plants, birds, mammals, and looked at the degree to which there's evidence that traits can evolve in response to climate. And we found, at least in amphibians and reptiles, about 60% of the studies found such an effect. However, most of those studies were looking at how populations evolved over climate gradients. And so very few studies to date can tell us if there's enough genetic variation to evolve rapidly enough to deal with the temporal scale of climate change. We know that it's happened in the past along these climate gradients, but we don't know how much rapidly it can occur for the future. But there is lots of potential out there in the landscape in terms of populations able to adapt to climate. So what do we do? How do we approach this grand challenge for the next 100 years to keep biodiversity alive until climate can return? Well, one of the suggestions is that we should basically just save half the Earth. And this is a robust scenario in some degrees. We just save lots of land and ocean and hope that everything works out. However, modeling and prediction is still important here because we have to choose which land to save. And if we're just going to go with the least cost, then we're going to save lots of northern Canada and Antarctica and not save much of the organisms. So we need to predict which species are at risk, which ecosystems are at risk, and what are the correct configurations of preserved land to protect them in a warming world. We also monitor a lot, and we're doing a better and better job of monitoring organisms and how they're affected by climate change and other drivers. But we can't just monitor species to extinction. So we need to predict those changes. And to mount a conservation effort, you often have to have those predictions in place for decades before to allow yourself enough time to save that species. So we just can't monitor things and watch them decline. We also have to predict which ones are declining next and how we can save them. Okay, so those are the predictions. That's where we're at now. How do we move forward? And so a few things here that I want to throw out there, and this is building off of some work that's published, some that's in process. I think we need to really concentrate on starting to add biology into these models. So add those biological mechanisms. And not only that, but we have to make them accessible to a large number of researchers, managers, people in government, people in nonprofits. So the reason people use correlative modeling is because it's easy and you can access it and do it using existing programs that are out there. There really aren't any mechanistic models that are really easily adaptable. There are a few for certain systems, but we don't really have that approach that allows us to do that. And so we're always building things de novo. And the climate scientists realized early on in the 50s that we need to share our models, we need to come together, we need to have a bunch of different framework models that we developed, but we're going to be able to share those different subcomponents and pick and choose which things we're going to use from those big platforms. We eventually want to be able to combine different modeling platforms. For example, for the same species, we know that when you combine predictions from different models, you can average out some of the structural uncertainties of those models and understand how the models work and which ones perform well or not. And the solutions are better when you integrate predictions from multiple models. And so we find that out with, say, hurricane prediction. What you see there is an ensemble prediction across many different models. We also have to collect the mechanistic data for these really data-hungry models. Once you include biology, you actually have to measure some things. So it's also an important effort going forward. And finally, we can't just throw predictions out there and say we're done. Modeling is a continuous thing. And so you build that model, you make the prediction, and then you start to validate it with hopefully data that's collected outside of what you use to parameterize it, so in time or space. And as you do that, you start to refine the model. You start to say, well, I don't need this part, but I do need this part, or we really need a good estimate of heritability for this trait in order to make a better prediction in the future. And so that's the only way that we're going to make those models better in the future. So in doing this, I must admit that I've adopted a sort of climate envy. I see the progress made by climate scientists in their models, and I want to have biologists adopt that approach and learn from that. And so as we look through the history of climate science, we see like 1955, the first climate circulation model. Pretty basic, but they were already forming mechanistic models back then. 1970 was a big climate conference suggesting that climate change was important and we needed to get the attention of world scientists. By 1982, there was papers that suggested that climate change was observable. And of course, James Hansen said that to the public in 1988. In 1989, the climate change integration panel was formed, and that led to these synthetic reports. Now, when we look at climate change biology, our first climate prediction of any species, or thinking about climate change predictions, was 1985. Again, that paper I showed. Soon after, we had our first climate conference that was sort of global in nature. So we're sort of catching up, more and more rapidly. Papers suggesting that biological impacts were observable by 2003. So I saw Camille on here, and she was a big part of those efforts. And we've got the Parallel Institute now, the IPBES now in 2012. But what this all is to show you, rather than a big history lesson, is the fact that we're behind by about 20 years in each of those cases. We're lagging about 20 years, and we can't lag anymore. And so we need to make really rapid progress. And just to see that the climate envy here, you see that the number of models of climate change increased over this period from 91 to 2013, from 2 to 45. The spatial resolution decreased from 500 kilometers to 50 kilometers. And the precision, the ability to represent hindcast data became much better through time as well. Now, we are beginning to create the next generation of these mechanistic models, and we can find examples of models that include biological mechanisms, such as where we separate them out here in these 6 different categories. Lots of discussion and argument about whether it was 6 or 8 or 10 or 3. Eventually we ended up on 6, but there are models that include species interactions now, dispersal, at a really fine resolution, and including even behavior, demographic models, physiological models, and understanding the environment, including interactions with other drivers. And there are evolutionary models that can make predictions in the future. But they're all sort of separated, and they generally don't combine these different mechanisms into one model. So they're sort of specialized on a particular part of the puzzle, but not the full puzzle. And so more recent work in a working group, we looked for mechanistic models that could be used for not just a single use or a single system, but could be expanded to apply to other systems. We found 50 of them, and I know this figure is kind of small. What we got is the 50 models here listed. The components are those 6 features, whether it's species interactions or evolution. Gray is to a limited degree, black is to a high degree. The modeling unit is what is the actual thing that's being modeled? Is it a population? Is it an individual? Is it ecosystem? Horizon is time and space. Most of them do pretty well there. Outputs are we outputting out diversity or population abundances. And accessibility is the degree to which these models can be used by other people, and how easy it is to use them to apply to their system. Because what we really want is people to start to use these models, but if they're not accessible, then they're not going to be used. And so, the point of this figure, though, is that there's a lot of white space. There's none of these models are comprehensive, and so we're often losing some of these features that might be important. And so, we're starting to argue about the idea that we need to have a platform like the Climate Scientist that we can use that incorporates all these mechanisms. So we have, different drivers here that are going to feed into genetics, which are then translated into traits along this yellow donut here, which then are combined through a demographic model to determine species abundance. And then those different models are going to interact with other species. So it's flexible enough that anyone can use it. It's modular, so people can sort of step through these trees of decisions and choose different submodels to use for their particular question organism. If we can move toward that, we can build those together and also in combinations that we can compare results using different types of modeling frameworks. That'd be a great goal for all of us to have, because as we build those, just like the climate models, we can start to actually get into the ability to make progress in multi-model analysis and ensemble modeling, and come into better predictions overall. So, the other thing I want to point out to you is that, most of these models that we looked at, they do not include any sort of interaction at this level between the drivers and the biodiversity model in terms of these circular feedbacks. And we think that's going to be pretty important. So one of the things that we've done in this new model is just create a simulation of what happens when you have combined drivers and biodiversity. And so we simulated a pollinator. So there's our simulated pollinator that's being affected by climate change in this area of southern France. And we're combining the crafty model, which is a land use model, which takes into account ideas about the goods and services and the use of the land, more of a social model, and then we've got this range shifter, which is a biodiversity model. And then we have the circular loop. And so, if we uncouple those models, we get a very different result than if we couple them. So in this case, you end up having a lot more crop when you couple them, because as the pollinator declines, you actually have to have much more crop to meet your demand. And you also take away from basically all the wild areas when you do that. And so it's a very different perspective. The pollinators decrease with the coupled model, and the crop supply as a percentage of demand is much less efficient as well. And so we need those coupled models to integrate the drivers and make those biodiversity projections if we're going to move forward with this exercise and use scenarios, use different integrated drivers, and then use a good biodiversity model. And so the other thing that we can do is that we can unite this approach in a dynamic framework. And so really excited by this, and maybe this can be something you can bring into your own work in terms of combining artificial intelligence and adaptive management. And I was a bit skeptical of the artificial intelligence at first, but I do think it can play an important role in the system. So just to step through here, you build and parameterize a model. Here we're envisioning an endangered species recovery plan. You build this, this nice model, the spin and top model, I call it. And you then define a management objective. So here we want to maximize the abundance of this endangered species, but also minimize the costs, say that the cost of the land that we have to preserve to protect that species. So that comes in here. We have different management plans here. We have a state variable here, which is the abundance distribution across the landscape. And then we have a reward in the parlance of artificial intelligence, where we want to define something that increases the abundance of the species. Well, that goes into this black computer box, and there's a model agent there that's going to maximize the abundance, and there can be other things in there like the decrease in the cost of that management plan. And it's going to iterate through all these different kinds of scenarios and find a management plan that does the best job. Well, all the purple here is the computer-aided management, and then we can actually use those plans, say, start to restore habitat. So there we have adaptive management now, and so the manager will instate that plan, and then we'll monitor and validate that model. And so maybe that habitat plan is working really well. We can feed that back in, or maybe it's not, and then we have to go in and refine our model, make a better model to predict the effects. And so there's sort of this looping of adaptive management and artificial intelligence and these more informed biological models that I think can do a good job of allowing us to respond to the future. Don't want to make you feel too upbeat. We have one problem we have to deal with, but we can do it, and that's the fact that these models require lots of high quality data. So again, in this hexagon of different mechanisms, we looked at the 4 best species we could find that have been modeled for climate change effects. So fence lizards, sockeye salmon, European beach trees, and speckled blue butterflies. And then we looked at the data available, and we categorized it as low in orange, medium, yellow, and high in green. And we find that for at least the species with high economic value, like the fish and the trees, we found that, you know, data was pretty good. There were some medium categories there, particularly in terms of evolution and dispersal for the beach, or evolution, species interactions, and the environment for the sockeye salmon. But, you know, for the two other species that aren't of economic concern, the butterfly and the lizard, lots of data gaps. And so it suggests that if these are the best four we could find, that the vast majority of species on Earth have limited information in these categories. And so it makes it hard to do a biological model if you don't have biological information. And that's really what's been holding us back for much of the time. And so I do suggest, you know, there's a call for going back to boots, binoculars, and beakers. So we need to collect natural history information, not just any information, but the information needed to parameterize these models and make better predictions. And so we're really a directed return to natural history. And we need to find value in that, so we get, you know, we're all not just seeking to do the next best thing, but we're also adding to our information to predict. And so just briefly, you know, one of the things that we've been doing with our system of marbled salamanders, which are expanding because of climate change, is trying to you know, build that information for the models. So collecting information on each of those 6 categories, you know, what is the food web? What is the physiology of these species? What are the drivers of their increase or decrease across the landscape? And what is their evolutionary effects? And so, you know, we've been really interested in how evolution could add resilience to the system where the marbled salamander is expanded. Wherever it goes, it decreases many prey species, other amphibians, other invertebrates. But maybe those species can adapt to this predator, because we know they do adapt in their native range. So how quickly can they adapt? And so we're doing lots of common garden experiments, but also experiments in experimental evolution and introducing predators to see how they respond genetically in real time. And so I think this is also something that we can all do in our own systems to gain that knowledge. And if we all do it in our own systems, then we're all, you know, we're gonna cover much of the world, right? If we do that. All right, so just to end here, and love to have a broader discussion of these topics. So in the 2000s, I think really categorized by science's ability to predict climate change. And you know, we should congratulate science for that. I mean, this was one of the biggest events in scientific history. And the climate scientists, you know, the unsung heroes here, they became heroes. They won the Nobel Peace Prize for that. I think that the 2020s have to now be the era of predicting climate change effects. So we're much more certain about climate change now. We need to predict the effects, you know, for biodiversity and ecosystems. If we can do that, I think that we will have done something as profound as climate science. And so we do need that. We need to make these predictions, to protect these species, to keep ecosystems intact until the climate change can return, and keep those losses from happening. And so with that, I'll end, and I'm happy to start the conversation.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's a great deal of material covered there. We have good time for questions available to us. I'd ask folks, if you'd like to ask a question, and please do use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and please go ahead.
Hey, do you want me to call, or are you going to call?
Oh, here we go. Travis, go ahead, please. We've got one from Travis. You're first up.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Mark. That was really interesting to listen to. So one of the challenges that I see with forecasting, and we discussed this a little bit in the modeling working group yesterday, is that it's really hard to forecast because of the fact that, like, there's a lot of assumptions. Even if you have really high quality data in one area of a range, there's a lot of assumptions if you're going to try and apply that range wide. And so we started discussing a little bit the idea of, you know, kind of sensitivity analysis versus what's the most accurate model that you could develop. And I was just curious if you could kind of speak to those different strategies, does that have a place in kind of your overall future framework of how to get this? I think both of them kind of have their pros and cons, but I was just curious what your thoughts were on those types of approaches, where instead of trying to come up with the best predictive model, it's more about exploring sensitivity.
Yeah, I think, yeah, as you suggested, both approaches are valuable and complementary in many ways. I think we do need to build our best assessment possible, but the most important part about a prediction is actually not always the prediction itself, but the uncertainty levels, right? And so I think we need to be really clear on that. And the interpretation of those predictions is very different if you have high or low uncertainty, and we can take lessons from the election on that, right? So I think regardless, we need to be really clear to policymakers about that uncertainty, even when it's uncomfortable. And many of our first initial models are going to be really uncertain, and but we need to be clear on that. In terms of the sensitivity, I think that's where we're going to learn a lot about the models and the important parameters. Because for one thing, the parameters are really expensive to get. And so if we can do sensitivity analyses and understand that one parameter is sensitive and one is not, then we can devote our resources to collecting better estimates of the sensitive parameters. And so that's where I see the iterative process coming in, is that you build a model, you attempt to validate it, say in another part of the range, you see what's really sensitive to the prediction, and then you say, okay, well that's a parameter we don't have good information on. Say it's differences in a trait between the two sites. Okay, well now we're going to go out and collect that and see how it improves the model or not. The other part about it is, I think, again, in a resource constrained world, we sort of want to have the best model that performs, that's also the simplest, right? So I have this big grand diagram of lots of different things interacting, but for some species, we may be able to get away with just a few of those mechanisms, or a correlative model does just fine. And so I think that's part of the understanding of the sensitivity that can help us to make greater strides, is by being able to refine those models for specific species. So just to give you examples, one of my colleagues is working on salt marsh sparrows, where they've done all the observations in biology to know that it comes down to the fact of how often their nests get flooded at high tide with sea level rise. And so they reduce this complicated question down to centimeters of sea level rise. And then they have the predictions of the tides and the sea level rise for the next 100 years. And then they can say in 2055, these populations won't exist anymore, because it's that simple. Now, it's not always going to be that simple. It's often going to be more complicated. But the more we can make those models, refine those models, use biological knowledge to refine them, and sensitivity analyses, we should be able to come up with simple but effective models in the end.
Thank you for the question, Travis, and thank you, Mark, for the response. Next question, Jen, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Mark. That was both depressing and inspirational. So thank you for both of those. I guess my question was, I wanted to go back to the kind of start of your talk where, and you finished with it too, that we have individual species that we should be looking at all of these mechanistic parameters on, but that we're excluding some regions of our world. And so I'm wondering if this reliance on English and science is one of those factors. So it's not only, so my question is, how do we increase the number, not only the number of studies, but also that ability for them, for those other countries to be publishing and getting that information out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I totally agree with you. I think that part of it is language barriers, and I think also differences in sort of the emphasis on certain research programs over others. Some places there's an emphasis on more practical research, related to industry and things like that, rather than sort of the more conservation issues that we may have the ability to address in Europe and North America. I'm probably least suited to answer that question in terms of, the social structures that we need, but certainly we want to, in whatever ways we can, support these regions in the development of models and making these predictions that can come in many forms. Ultimately, I think we need a global organization that can do that. And I think that we can also encourage people with the expertise to partner with groups in these regions that are understudied to collaborate and make some progress as well, while remaining sensitive to the fact that it's their turf and they know much more than we do. But yeah, I think partnerships and some ability to send resources to critical areas that are understudied.
Yeah, thank you.
Camille, go ahead, please.
Hi, Mark. Really enjoyed the talk. I'm actually more pessimistic than you are specifically about the role of evolution. So I totally agree with you that we're already seeing evolution in real time to climate change, and that this, I think, will be incredibly important at the population level, as to which populations might survive, and that it could potentially be a very powerful management tool if we can, effectively move genes around populations to make some populations more resilient to climate change. But given, if you take a step back and look at the species as a whole, in terms of real-time evolution, we're not seeing any species come up with new mutations that allow them to live in a different climate space. If you look at the paleo record, you basically get that same type of information. And if you look at the experimental work where people are trying to essentially use artificial selection to get species to move out of their known climate space, they don't respond to it. So, well, I do agree with you that the role of evolution is very important. And as I said, I think it's very important to conservation biology and to sort of the local and regional scale. I'm not sure I agree with you that it's super important to include in models of whether or not the entire species, if your question is this species going to go extinct or not? I don't think it's actually that important to have to include evolution, because that's the information we have is simply that evolution isn't going to preserve a species if their climate space disappears. And that's not even thinking about dispersal ability. Can the species actually get to the climate space where it's going? If it disappears within, a few hundred kilometers of where that species lives, the species isn't likely to be able to disperse there anyway. So I guess this is more of a comment, but I'm wondering, that might help simplify the idea of how, if you're trying to get towards more mechanistic models, how many things do you have to think of trying to include, and thinking of only including evolution when your question is sort of more oriented towards how is this particular protected area going to work in terms of preserving the biodiversity it was set up for, or how is this species going to do in this area given a certain amount of climate change and its adaptive ability.
Yeah, no, it's a great discussion, and we could probably spend a lot of time probably in a pub discussing it. I think
a pub would be much better.
I think that the short answer, and I'll give a longer answer, but the short answer is I think we don't know enough. This is the biggest gap we have in terms of adaptive potential in climate change. As I said, the models are pretty limited. Even for systems in which we understand evolution relatively well, it's often just for a few traits, and we may not know the correct traits to measure. We measure temperature sensitivity, but in the end, it's a novel pathogen that undoes the systems, and it's not gonna that trait's not gonna help us. And so I do, if it's the right morning and I get out of bed, I do think that at least for some species, they can evolve, and that comes from our understanding of rapid evolution in many, many systems now. Evolution that's both rapid and relatively at fine spatial scales. And if it is just one population that can evolve, then the species is also preserved. So I would say that it's not just the population level, because the species is made up of populations, but it may be in a very different way. If only one population survives at an entire range, that's not really saving the species, I would say. But yeah, I'm still hopeful that there are organisms with enough genetic variation, and we can even support that genetic variation by maintaining larger populations, and even gasp in the future of shifting genes around so we can facilitate gene flow that could lead to some adaptations. I do think it'll play a role, and I think also what I haven't mentioned is the degree to which adaptive variation across a range can actually lead to some resilience in terms of those populations shifting or coming together to create new solutions, for example, to novel climates. But at the end of the day, I thought your butterfly was going to adapt to the new host plant. But I guess that's all plasticity, right?
No, it does evolve to eat new host plants, and that's a genetic evolution. It's not.
That is okay. That is genetic adaptation.
Yeah, that's genetic evolution.
Okay. Well, so that's a bright point, right? So, but you just don't think it's going to happen for many others.
Well, no, but so how does that help it adapt to a new climate space? So yes, it can evolve to use new host plants very rapidly within a decade, which is 10 generations. So that's exciting and great, but does that help it live in a different climate space? We haven't seen that yet.
Right. Yeah. So I think in that case, it's this interaction of species interaction that at least adapting to a new host plant allowed it to survive.
Yes.
But in terms of a novel climate, yeah, I think that's an open question.
Yeah.
But in terms of
really interesting, we'll start seeing novel climates really soon. So I think we're going to have some real-time data within our lifetimes. I mean, seriously.
Yeah, but in terms of the last question I never really got to is in terms of whether we can exclude it. It is the most difficult and costly parameter to get, I think, because you're talking about experiments or genomics or something, and so in terms of cost, I could see eliminating it, but in terms of the power of it completely changing your prediction, that's high as well. So sort of costly, but could completely alter your conclusion. So I would say leave it in as much as you can.
Thank you so much for the question and comment, Camille, and a great discussion there. Thank you, Mark. Matt Williamson, you had a question or your hand up. Would you like to go ahead, please?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. I guess following on Camille's comment and sort of where my question lies from the talk is that there is a species that has been able to sort of dramatically alter how it responds to climate, and that would be humans. And in looking at your model, I wonder what opportunities there might be to incorporate the sort of richness that might exist in that human impact surface, because presumably the dynamics of that system are changing much more rapidly than these ecological or biological mechanisms. And so I guess I'm wondering how sensitive you think the existing model is to assumptions about stationarity and human impacts, and what opportunities there may be to collect key parameters to sort of help that portion of the model keep pace with the biological portions of the model.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, so this gets at the point that I was making about the integration of drivers, and so that model that I really just went over really quickly with the simulated pollinator, the humans are actually responding to socioeconomic conditions in terms of how they use the landscape and how they plant crops and convert wildlands to crops and adapt to this climate change in which the pollinator is declining. And so they plant more they have to plant more to meet the demand for the crop because the pollinators' services become less efficient. So that's a really simple toy approach, but it does suggest that humans are adapting to socioeconomic conditions which are created by the biology of the pollinator. So I think it's really critical to include those feedbacks. And it can be things like humans changing where they live, for example, along coasts. It can be other behaviors as people change their need for roads or change their aggregation patterns, things like that. So yeah, I think that's something that's really excluded from almost all models. But you can get very different results when you include those feedbacks. And so I think this isn't just a biodiversity model, but we're also talking about socio-ecological interactions that could be incorporated for really dynamic interplay. Of course, I think human behaviors are really difficult to predict. If I thought they were easy, I would, play the stock market. But so it's a huge uncertainty, but something that we should at least explore different scenarios, right? And sort of understand the assumptions of those scenarios and explore what might happen under those. But definitely the interplay is going to be important.
Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. We have a comment in the chat from Stephanie Geller adding to the conversation. There's a recent or neat article that came out in Science this past month on the topic of genetic diversity and translocation success in tortoises. Stephanie, did you have a question that you wanted to kind of add to that? Yeah, go ahead, please, Stephanie.
Sorry, yeah, that was actually in response to one of Jen's comments also in the thread. It's really awesome to see this conversations happening kind of side by side. I actually had a question for Mark regarding some of your figures. In particular, that last figure that showed the different layers of mechanisms leading up to your population and demography and also phenology. And I was wondering if that's been published yet, that really awesome figure.
No, that's some new work that's coming out of a working group at the Quebec Center for Biodiversity Science, and so it's in review right now. I haven't heard back, but this has sort of been this ongoing group of people from around the world that became interested in predicting climate change responses back, decades ago, and there's sort of been these different mediums that have popped up around the world, and this is sort of the latest reincarnation of that group. And really our latest aim, which is sort of what I presented at the end, was to expand beyond sort of the need and create a practical approach to get into a point where the world is talking about more accessible and flexible models like the climate scientists have. And so we're kind of throwing that idea out there as a challenge. And then once it's out there, we hope to actually make good on the promise of it and start to try to make some headway on that global effort. But yeah, no, it's not published yet. It's, who knows?
Glad to know it's in review. We'll keep an eye out for it on Google Scholar. I think your talk was awesome. I agree. It was also very inspirational and gave me some good language to work with as well. So that's really exciting. And it seems like in the chat, there's been some good discussion too, just about translocation and where evolution kind of ties in there. So I think with that being one of the tools that people are using for managing species that are on the brink, yeah, it'll be cool to see kind of how evolution ties with those moving forward.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, when it gets published, I'll try to remember to send it to you.
That'd be sweet. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Stephanie. Great question, and thanks for your response, Mark. Sanford Eigenbrode has a question. Over to you, Sanford.
Hi. Also, just reiterate what a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. How I didn't realize, how immersed you have been over a decade in this work, and congratulations on that. But my question is about, obviously we need global policies oriented towards learning enough to not only build these models, but implement policies to respond to them. It's all very costly. So I wonder if these working group ever thinks about taking the estimates of what kind of efforts are needed, what kind of data are needed, and translate that into some kind of an estimate of the global costs of learning what we need to learn. I think even though that might be kind of a daunting figure, at least having an estimate of it might actually make the potential to develop a policy in at least you have the feasibility before us, and
Right.
kind of can think about, okay, that's what we require. Maybe that's where you go. We still need to work with keystone species, and we need to prioritize which ones we're going to invest in. Oftentimes conservation just focuses on, we're just going to focus on the hot spots. We can't even begin to understand what's going on with individual species, but we need to preserve at least habitats, and then we can study the implications of that, but we're not going to be able to obtain the data needed for all those target species, or maybe we are. I really don't know how much it costs. So what have you thought about that with your teams?
Yeah, so we've thought a great deal about it, and I don't have an easy solution because we have all sort of debated what that overall cost would be, and we were just thinking in terms of what would it take to design a platform similar to a coupled climate model, but with the greater challenges of biology, which takes, I think, a lot more subcomponents to it. And in the back of an envelope, and on the back of an envelope, we suggested that somewhere around the range of $100 million over 10 years would provide a flexible platform, that then could be distributed to people and developed in concert with stakeholders and taught to them to some degree.
That sounds really cheap. I think that's great. That's a great price.
Right. Well, that's what we thought too. We thought, and we struggled. We said, well, that's kind of the bare minimum, but we think we could do it for that. And then we looked at what is the cost of the International Space Station, what is the cost of the Hadron Collider, how much is spent on building climate change models each year, and it's a fraction of those prices, right? So it's, I think we calculated, of those three things, it's like 1% of them to be devoted into biodiversity prediction, and so it seems like a good deal.
It seems like a good deal. I think it'd be really important to get that estimate out there. I mean, it's just another layer on the estimates you are making about the data needed. What's the cost of getting those data? Pretty exciting.
That doesn't include necessarily the cost of getting the data for the models, right? I think that's another cost that's not in there. That's just developing the model.
Okay.
The hope is that
I understood that.
Researchers can work in their own system to collect that data. I do think it'd be great to have an incentive, either could be through publication or through grant structures, people to collect that information. But yeah, that's the other difficult part is
this project that you're addressing, is two species basically.
Right. I do agree that we have
big investment.
We have to prioritize to some degree, and it's going to be probably things already at risk, keystone species, which we've kind of manipulated into these biotic multipliers of climate change, which are both sensitive to climate change and have large impacts on the ecosystem, and species of human concern. I think those are the three that are going to be prioritized first. But we can also think about an approach where we do representative species across taxonomy and ecosystems and regions as well. So I think there's two different ways to prioritize in the beginning.